Welcome to the Rock's Back Pages podcast. I'm Barney Hoskins, and I'm here with my colleagues Mark Pringle.
Hi, Barney.
And Jasper Mirison-Bowie.
Hello, Barney.
And we are delighted today to welcome special guest Sheryl Garratt. Hi, Sheryl.
Hello.
So glad you could join us, especially in the week that sees the new edition of your classic book, Adventures in Wonderland, which we'll be talking about later. Tying in with this, we'll be hearing clips from an audio interview with the veteran DJ Terry Farley, and we will also be talking a little about the Street's Mike Skinner. But first, Sheryl, we want to know everything about your journey from Birmingham to becoming editor of The Face, writing this book, and right up to the present day. In fact, the earliest pieces of yours we have on RBP are from 1981, when you were, I think, still at school in Brum. Is that true?
No, I would have been at uni by then. I think, I wrote for Enemy when I was still at school.
You
I think,
did? Oh, we've got to
when
get
Neil
those
Spencer
pieces.
first met me, he was quite shocked, because they'd sort of not really twigged that they've got a 16-year-old working for them.
So what year was your first piece what year was your first piece published anyway? Was it have been the NME?
No, I was writing a lot, as a kid, and I was involved in Birmingham Rock Against Racism. So they had their own paper, I had my own fanzine, and I was writing for Temporary Hoarding. So I was writing an awful lot of stuff, usually under names like Sheza.
Would you prefer us to call you Sheza throughout this episode?
In fact,
You sure?
I remember saying to Neil Spencer, I'd like to be called Sheza in Enemy, and he just looked at me and went, no, you wouldn't. And I'm really grateful for that now.
Yeah, I think you owe him a lot. So you first wrote for the NME I'm guessing 81. There's a live review of The Beat, and there's this lovely piece about musical youth. I think before they were even called musical youth.
Yeah, I mean, they got signed because of that piece. And they were kind of, my Uncle Tony sort of put musical youth together. He was one of the big reggae promoters in Birmingham, and he was amazing to me. Like, he introduced me to people like Burning Spear.
Wow.
My first question to Burning Spear, why is reggae so sexist and why are there no women in reggae? Yeah, like I say, I was very young. That was my first question. And he just sat down and went, this will take some time. And he just sat and introduced me to the O3s, to Judy Marr, wrote me a great big listening list. He didn't go away, little girl, you don't know what you're talking about. He sat down very patiently and gave me a whole list of music, which,
great.
Again, so grateful.
That's amazing.
And you moved up to London in 82?
Dates are a blur to me. I came up to London to come to university, so I think 79, 80, can't remember. Okay.
And so you wrote, I remember you, because it was when I first started writing for Enemy, so I remember your byline. I don't think I met you in that period. And you would have written for Enemy for, 2-3 years before going to City Limits, something like that?
That's right. I wrote for Enemy throughout doing an English degree, basically. And it paid my way. I couldn't have managed in London without that, really. And I used to the reason you never met me is I was so chronically shy. I would only come in either very early in the morning or very late, and Graham Lott would wait for me to give me my album of the week to review, and then I'd slip back out again. And I was terrified of you all. I thought I would go in and Paul Morley would just turn around, point at me and go, she doesn't know what she's doing, and I would be found as a fraud and, exposed by Ian Penman for not using words that were long enough. So
what we realised now, of course, is everyone was terrified, but no one was honest about it.
I think that's the thing you realise in retrospect. And I was very lucky that Julie Burchell took me under her wing very early on and gave me a lot of support and just kept going, you've got her back in there, ask for some more. And she was just so great. Oh,
that's really good to hear. That's fantastic. So you went to City Limits, and then, we'll fast forward a little bit. I'm sure City Limits but you are, famous for having been, famous for many things, but you were the editor of The Face for 6 years?
Yeah, 6-7 years, yeah. And I was there a couple of years before that, doing kind of music clubs and production. So, yeah, I was there quite a long while. And I do want to, City Limits was the best training ground because I was doing the music and clubs, and it was before word processors. So we typed that stuff up every single week.
Yes.
So I knew where every nightclub in London was because I typed it week in, week out, and I could walk into any club or venue in London. And I think that was really important. What I took to the face was just this encyclopedic knowledge of what was going on in London, plus knowing what was going on in Birmingham and Manchester, because I went home a lot and I got a lot of friends in Manchester. So I think that's what I bought there, really. There wasn't much I didn't know about what was going on in music and clubs in London.
No, and that's very clear from Adventures in Wonderland, which you've revised and I think sort of updated to some extent. It's coming out this very week. We're really honoured to have you on the podcast.
Just before we all got together now, I just reached the paragraph where Tony Wilson has voluntarily closed a hacienda. So basically I got this on, 3 days ago, and I've got that far into the book. It's fantastic. I'm so enjoying it.
It is so great.
It's right. It's great. I'm also really enjoying it.
And it's now got a different subtitle from when you first published it, which was 1999, when it was a decade of club culture. It's now subtitled Acid House, Rave, and the UK Club Explosion. And I mean, it's I don't know whether the word definitive is appropriate, but what's so great about it is it's written by someone who was right on the inside of many of these scenes. I mean, you really, really experienced it. It's not being written historically at one remove. You were a participant.
No, again, I'd like to say it was kind of calculated, but it was total luck that I happened to be the person the Face sent to do the first Chicago house story. And total luck that Frankie Knuckles was one of the interviews. We really got on. So he said, do you want to go out? And took me out to all the clubs that nobody else has been to, that closed down in the year after that. Ron Hardy, I think, who was one of the great house DJs, and I stood in his DJ booth with Frankie, I think was dead a year later. So It was a real experience. And also being a Laker baby, the 99 flights to New York were available when I was in my early 20s. So Manhattan clubs were a bit of a playground. It was possible to go for a weekend. That was my review money from NME for sort of 2 months, would buy me a weekend clubbing in New York. So I've been to all of those clubs. I've been to the Paradise Garage. I've been to the early Chicago clubs, and I knew all those people, but by sheer chance.
I really envy you going to Paradise Garage. I mean, in retrospect, it's something I'd love to have done. I mean, Larry Levan is such a fantastic DJ.
Yeah, it was like watching a conductor conduct the orchestra. He could literally put something on and get one side of the room dancing and the other side just sort of sneering, and then he'd move it. So it switched over. He knew exactly where everyone was in the room and what they wanted. It's an extraordinary thing to behold. It should have been you. Been you. It should have been you. It could have been you.
So the first piece that we're going to feature is in fact that piece from the Face, September '86, is before you were the editor. It's called Sample and Hold, the House Sound of Chicago. And it really is, it's so wonderfully like fly on the wall, and the fact that Ron Hardy, pops up in the piece. He's actually there. It's such an important piece because it played its part in, seeding really the club culture that we all now know about. So from there to the sort of the superstar DJs of the 90s, there is a real thread, there's a real continuum, isn't there? And your book is essentially, it goes all over the place, which I really like. So the different chapters cover different scenes and different people and styles of music. But essentially it is about the phenomenon of the DJ and the clubs, the extraordinary scenesterish snobbery and wonderful liberation of it all. Looking back, when you went to Chicago that time, could you have foreseen where all this was ultimately going to go, Sheryl?
No. I'd love to say yes, but
Sure.
no. I mean, the piece actually records, they didn't know. They were completely blagging it. They were signing anything that moved in Chicago at the time. They knew they'd got something, but they had no idea what it was. And people would, they'd sign their own lawyer to make a record, and he was rapping.
Yes.
They got all these rappers trying to make up a new type of rap they were calling roping. And, at one point the PR just went, we signed all these people. I don't know their names, but here's some photos of them. They had no idea. It was just blundering about. And I think that's why I'm saying there was an element of luck, that I kind of lucked into connecting with Frankie, and he was like, I'll show you what's really going on. And then took me into the studio where Marshall Jefferson was recording, and it took me to the clubs where the house scene was really going on. And I think that was just sheer luck to have kind of just connected with him at the right time.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, our friend Simon Witter, who's kind of out there very much around the same time, he's there in July of '86, and he was screwed by the NME. They wouldn't let him cover it. He did manage to sell a piece to ID around.
Which came and he was the only other person who went to the music box, I believe.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think we were all reading this stuff thinking, what are they talking about? It's interesting because I shared management with Mike Pickering, and he'd be in the corner of the office sort of smoking joints and raving about this stuff. And then he released Carino, T-Coy, came out on Deconstruction. I didn't get it. I'm ashamed to say it. I didn't get it. Didn't get house music when it first emerged. It happened right under my nose. And I missed it.
But even T-Coy, when it first came out, we were calling it something like, I can't remember now. It was considered more of a jazz record than a house record.
Yeah.
And it took a while to take root, especially in London. In London, Manchester, it took root really quickly because it had the same rhythm as Northern Soul, I think.
Absolutely.
But in London, it was just another music in the mix along with hip-hop, funk, go-go,
In the audio interview we're going to be talking about in a minute, Terry Farley is very funny about precisely that, about how London didn't get it. It just took a surprising amount of time. He says it's partly because the established scene was so strong in London, which is about rare groove primarily at that point.
Exactly that.
And so the resistance was really strong to it. How interesting.
And also MDMA was the kind of VIP room drug there.
Right.
It's like it took a while to catch on as a club drug. I'd seen it as a drug that people took in back rooms and stroked each other on the cushions, and it was like, not for me, mate. I'm going back out to dance with my mates. So I didn't think it was an attractive thing to try at all. And I think that was the key thing. When MDMA came into the mix, suddenly we all got it.
Yeah.
Sheryl, talk briefly, if you would, about just the Faces' role in covering all these scenes. I mean, the second piece, for example, is not about house. It's this account of going to the third Blackpool Soul, Funk and Jazz Weekender in April 1989. You were writing about things like that obviously grew out of the whole Northern Soul scene. So I mean, the Face was very attentive to all this stuff, wasn't it?
Well, I would say it was more the opposite. This was my life, and occasionally I was allowed to put it into the magazine. It's like I went out 6 nights a week, every week. I got into the habit from City Limits, and that's what I did. And we travelled all around the country to go to all-dayers and all-nighters and to soul weekenders and stuff. And occasionally I'd walk into the Face and say, I think we should really cover this. And everyone would go, yeah.
Okay.
And I think the key thing was, at one point, Nick Logan said he was considering closing the Face at the end of the 80s. He felt, it would be a fantastic statement to just finish the magazine, either on its 100th issue or at the end of the 80s. And I really strongly felt there was this big new youth culture coming through, and we should be covering it. And, one day we sort of had this chat, and we were having the same discussion we'd had about this. And he just said, well, who are these people? And I said, well, there were 20,000 of them dancing in a field I went to last night. And he went, fine, do a magazine for them then. Let's see how that works. And of course, the circulation of the magazine shot up. And after that, I felt we got permission. And by then, a lot of the design team were younger. Pat was from Manchester. He was already bringing things like the Happy Mondays into the office and saying we should be covering this. And it felt like we were finally covering what we were doing, instead of trying hard to be the cool kids.
And you write in the book about the phenomenon of what we could call the indie dance crossover, when dance starts to kind of infiltrate northern indie music, and the whole Magister phenomenon unfolds from there. I mean, that is an extraordinary moment, isn't it? And it really made me think about how, like, the Mondays and the Roses were sort of, to some degree, in opposition to, like, the Smiths, and the whole Morrissey's whole kind of horrible Hang the DJ thing.
Exactly.
So it's fascinating reading about that era. The third piece is looking back at, the second summer of love for the Face, but in 1997, so it's almost a decade later. And that's an interesting piece where you essentially argue that, because we haven't even mentioned Ibiza or anything like that, but you argue that it wasn't as revolutionary as some claim. And your book, in a sense, is about the bigger picture of the phenomenon of clubbing itself, isn't it? What prompted when did you first start thinking about writing the book?
I think when I stopped going clubbing, which was, after my son was born, I had the delusion that most people have when they have their first child, that, 3 months after he was born, I'd somehow park him at a cupboard and get back to normal life.
You fly to New York. Yeah.
Yeah, so, and I very clearly remember the first time we did go to a club. It was a Chuff Chuff party, my friends in Birmingham, and we left our son with my mum and dad, who adored him. And we went to this all-nighter. And by 11 o'clock, me and my husband were looking at each other and going, I miss him. Should we go home? And then we realised actually we weren't going to be dancing all night anymore, and that our lives had changed, and that, also, it's about time we let some young people have a bit of space on the dance floor, because we had hogged it for quite a long time by then. So, I think it was closure for me. It was like, if this isn't going to be what I do 5-6 nights a week anymore, I'd like to write about what it was like. And also knowing that I'd been in the middle of it. I think it was Pete Tong who first said, why haven't you written a book about this?
Mm-hmm. Was it? Okay.
Yeah.
So it's Tongy, as Terry Farley calls him, Tongy, that we have to thank, really, for Adventures in Wonderland.
We have to thank him for his patience, for the number of times we rang him at home at 4 a.m. to tell him it had all gone Pete. I think, which was probably really funny the first 3 times, but we did it rather more than that.
I'm curious, did the structure of the book kind of come naturally, or was it something that you had to kind of figure out how to fit together?
Really hard, because club culture isn't linear, and people will say, I invented this, and someone else will say, I invented this, and they're both right, because things develop so interweaving, music that started in Chicago, Detroit, and New York. And until I started writing it, I had no idea that Larry Levan and Frankie Knuckles had been childhood friends, or that all the boys in Detroit were going to the clubs in Chicago and New York. I didn't know how interlinked they were. And then you're trying to sort of weave in the influence that Ibiza had on that, and then the whole British history that started, perhaps with all-nighters and the Northern Soul scene. So you were interweaving all these different strands. The reggae and soul sound systems in London were really important to warehouse parties.
Sure.
And so you've got all these disparate strands. And it was much easier from 88 to 90, because it became a much more linear story.
Yeah.
But even then, you've got things like the Blackburn raves, which kind of popped up completely independent of the Southern raves. Mm-hmm. So it was hard, and I still think you read it and it's like it's packed full of names and facts, and I hope I've interwoven the stories.
I found it really remarkably straightforward read, given the fact that it's exactly what you've just described. I mean, I really like the way you, first of all, sort of like trace some of the early roots, Levan, but also going back to David Mancuso and the Loft parties and so on and so forth. And that establishes sort of, disco and those sorts of roots. But then it is very clear. I love the way you sort of sidestep into Ibiza, how these English kids escaping from Thatcher's Britain, living on next to nothing, wash up in Ibiza and discover this entirely different way of doing things, and the drug which went with it. And that's what's they come back to England, November 87, and Shoom opens just like a couple of months later or a month later, and the whole thing sort of explodes after. And no, I think you really handled that tricky material really well.
And it was so weird from my point of view, because some of those people were my friends, seeing them come back and go, what on earth has happened to you? These people who left with quite nice haircuts suddenly wearing ponytails and, wearing bright purple tie-dye T-shirts. And, at first we were just aghast. What the hell is happening here? Yeah. And then, I went to a couple of the little parties they'd set up, and it was like, oh my God, no, I'm in. I'm definitely in,
That's the way love is. That's the way love is. Two people don't get along.
And you don't shirk the kind of criminal elements that infiltrate these scenes and the damage that was done. It did turn pretty dark, not least around the hacienda. My God, I mean, it's really sobering, literally, to sort of revisit some of the stuff that happened at that time, Sheryl.
And I think one of the important things to say about the hacienda is because it's closed and they've got nothing to lose, they've all been brutally honest. But there was lots of other things going on where, promoters asked me to take things out of the book because, it could cause them real problems. Sort of one promoter said to me when I sent him some stuff to read, it was like, yeah, you've been really clever here, but you will get one of us killed. So I cut it all, So with the hacienda, it had closed for good. You could tell that story, and the people inside it were willing to tell that story. But, it happened to an awful lot of other promoters. It wasn't just a Manchester thing, and it wasn't just a hat.
Of course. But I'm reading about kids who are just innocently selling E's to their pals, ending up in the alleyway behind clubs with guns in their mouths. I mean, it's pretty shocking.
Exactly that.
But I mean, it's also a very timely publication of the book right now, Sheryl, given, everything we've read in the last couple of weeks about illegal raves and quarantine raves. You wrote a piece for The Guardian last Saturday, and then following that, 3 or 4 days later, was this piece by Sheryl Garratt, if I'm pronouncing the name right, which was quite disturbing. So what is your take on the summer that's coming? I mean, are you concerned? Your piece is obviously sympathetic. You understand that young people are kind of cabin fever crazy. So how are you looking at it all right now?
I think this has been building for a couple of years. I've been hearing about them for a couple of years. And, there's been an unprecedented sort of 20% of our nightclubs closed in 2018, for instance, and they've carried on closing. There's so few places for people to play now, for people to gather and play. Our city centres have just become luxury flats with all the life sucked out of them.
Like
bars are getting more and more expensive. Yes. And people need to be able to gather, and they need spaces to gather. And because they're being pushed out, these parties have been happening in woodlands and fields, and there's not even abandoned warehouses like we had, because they're now all luxury apartments. So I have huge sympathy for it, and of course huge fear as well, because the virus hasn't gone away. But I can totally see why people want to gather and dance. It's part of human nature. It's a tribal thing, and it goes back. The earliest cave paintings show pictures of people dancing, and some of them are like 40,000 years old, So we're not going to kind of get it out of young people now. And after this period of isolation, I met some friends on the beach a couple of weeks ago, and for the first time, and we all nearly cried, and it was 8 of us sitting 2 meters apart, and we'd been talking via Zoom throughout. But it's people need people, she said, to sound like a horny old song. And I do think we have this thing in this country where we're really suspicious of people enjoying themselves. We always think it's slightly suspect and needs to be sat on, and we keep changing the law, and then we change the law, and it doesn't work, and eventually we find a way of accommodating it. And it would be so much better if we were sitting down now and thinking, well, this is obviously going to happen. How can we accommodate it and make it as safe as possible? Instead of going like, we will take the full force of the law onto these kids. It's like when you've got WhatsApp to spread where a rave is, how on earth are you ever going to stop it? I mean, they couldn't stop us when there was mobile phones and phone banks, in 89. They're not going to stop it now that there's closed social networks.
One of the characters I found remarkably sympathetic, you talked to him quite extensively, is that fairly senior policeman in the south of England, whose name I've course, I'm
Ken
telling.
Tappenden, yeah.
That's right. I ended up really liking him, and he was talking about he'd be at the edge of this party, and he'd find himself nodding his head to the groove, you know, which I thought was really sweet.
That's very funny.
Well, I think one of the things that shocked the police about the 89 raves is, you know, they went in expecting to find this kind of unruly mob, and what they found were their own kids with big smiles on their faces dancing, you know. Yeah. And it was a bit difficult to sort of demonise them once you'd met them. I mean, there were all the early tabloid headlines about biting the heads off pigeons and all this ridiculous nonsense. And then you went to them and it was a like load of kids with their arms around each other smiling.
Yeah, yeah.
I remember that from the police. You'd be running towards them to try and get into the party, and you'd have big grins on their faces, and they'd be standing there, and then they couldn't help themselves. They'd start smiling because it was funny.
Yes. Yeah.
I think you're absolutely right to note that it's not that the raves happening now during the lockdown, they're not random in the sense that it's been an ongoing thing over the last few years where as all the clubs have been shut down one by one, and the licensing laws have changed to make it increasingly impossible to open anything past, 11 o'clock when the good people want to go to sleep or something. It does make it extremely difficult to, as you say, go out and enjoy yourself. And it's not just, now we're all locked up and we're going to do these things. It's, we were doing these things before, and now that's literally the only outlet that people have to go out. And so I think it's not surprising, really.
Oh, no.
No, we need to be finding spaces where people can play, in the middle of our city centres. And we need to make that a priority. We can't turn everything into luxury apartments.
Like I said, as a sort of late developing raver, I spent quite a few of the last few years going to a lot of very sort of underground parties and curious bits of warehouse space and so forth around Hackney. And they all closed one by one. Mostly because a block of flats had gone up next to it.
Exactly.
And the people living in the block of flats didn't want to be disturbed. Yet the people were buying those flats to be in that part of town because it's exciting in the first place. This is the paradox. It's the very thing that
that's what happens. It sanitises the area they've just spent £1 million to buy their penthouse in.
Yes, absolutely. Dismal.
We're gonna bring down the walls. Let them fall, 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 fall. We're gonna bring down.
It's probably a good moment to hear the first of our Terry Farley clips.
Yeah, no, let me just sort of briefly kind of introduce the interview as such. It's Bill Brewster and Frank Broughton interviewing Terry Farley in 2005. I mean, Terry Farley's really interesting because he's a classic sort of old-fashioned soul boy. He's a couple of years younger than me. He was born into what's really Notting Dale, sort of that end of Notting Hill, rehoused in Slough. He goes right back to his youth, that when he was still in Notting Dale, they could hear blues parties, reggae blues parties down the road from where they lived and so on and so forth. He grew up with that sort of culture around him. Then the classic thing of people who move to places like Slough and looking for a scene, looking for something as teenagers that they can get into.
And desperately wanting to be back in London. Yeah.
And desperately want to be back in London.
Yeah.
And what he discovered was this club Crackers, which
was amazing.
You know very well, Sheryl, yeah. Which was a rare thing for a central London club. It's a predominantly black club with a significant gay aspect to it as well. So let's listen to him talking about Crackers.
So how did you get to hear about Crackers? Was that the main club that you went to, or the other?
That was the first club I went to where it was like, wow, this is just amazing. I think, and talking to other people nowadays, people like Cole Cox, Norman Jay, Paul Trouble Anderson, there's loads of people there who are the same age, 16 sort of thing, and it was like, wow, it was. I think before then, there certainly was places. There were places like Gulliver's, and there were soul clubs. But kind of like it was almost like that's the first club for that generation of people. Before then it was for older people who obviously didn't want young kids in there.
Yeah, I mean, he's very interesting about Crackers. The really good dancers are the black kids, and as a white kid, You would stand to one side, you'd stand around the walls of the room nodding your head, dancing modestly, but you didn't dare go into the middle of the dance floor because it's hyper-competitive, really, really interesting. From there, and he talks about then coming out of that, going to the soul all-dayers and weekenders, Sheryl, you were just talking about. In fact, your lives must be quite parallel to some extent. He's very much talking about sort of the late 70s, early 80s, the rare groove scene, and then first hearing house and being sort of, fairly baffled. And should we listen to the next clip, Barney, straight away? Just what we were talking about earlier was about how house didn't really fit in London and how house was sort of accepted. This is really interesting stuff.
Can you feel it? Feel it? Can you feel it? Feel it? Can you feel it? Can you feel it? Can you feel it?
I mean, the first time I remember sort of house as like, right, this is something different and now we're going to play that, was at the Raid. When I used to wall up there, and Pete Tong and Oki were the two main DJs. And I think it was just at the time Tongy was trying to get that whole thing going with London. And he would play like half an hour of it. And people just didn't know how to react to it. It wasn't a case of we don't like it, but it was just like, we had our records,
Did they clear the floor?
Well, people just never danced, and it kind of like, suddenly like Love Can't Turn Around and things like that would be played, and people just didn't know how to dance to it. It just didn't go with how people were dancing. They was doing that sort of WAP type dance, and the little thing and the little jazz moves, and that was still all part of it. That sort of 70s moves and the hip hop. You could play like a Def Jam record next to a Go-Go record, and you could play a James Brown record. Then you could play like the Fat Band, and then you could play some new record that was, coming out of America that was funky. But then you played a house record, and it was kind of like, what am I supposed to do with this? It didn't fit in with everything else.
Yeah.
I think it only worked when it was like, right, it's only house.
That's interesting because Sheryl, you sort of say differently in your book. The early days that you felt that people could play house amongst sort of other funkier sort of stuff.
I think you've got to remember that a lot of the clubs I were going to were mixed gay clubs. So
right.
Places like Asylum and Pyramid, people like Mark Moore and Colin Faver were definitely putting house into the mix. And I think because it sort of felt like a more grown-up cousin to High Energy, a gay crowd did know how to dance to it. So,
sure.
On the dance floor at Heaven or at the Jungle at Busby's, definitely house was in the mix and people knew how to dance to it.
That's really,
but it was
interesting.
one of many strands. It was mixed up with all the music Terry's talking about there.
Sure. Well, his experience was slightly more being in a room full of people who used to rare groove and then a house tune going in.
Yeah, and at the Soul Weekenders, there was real hostility to it. Definitely.
He talks
the weekenders he's talking about.
Yeah. Anyway, so he talks about, first taking his first E, discovering Shoom. He says he went down probably like to the third or fourth promotion of Shoom, being absolutely riveted by it, seeing these guys coming back from Ibiza, Danny Rampling in particular. And we've got a clip we'll play at the end of the podcast, which is so funny, where he talks about Danny Rampling's acid house dance, which was unlike anything he's sort of seen before. And he talks about him and Weatherall starting Boyzone, and also how cliquey the scene could be. And then he sort of goes on through the interview, the end of it. It's a long interview, so it's over 2 hours long. He talks about he and Bill and Frank discussed the emergence of the superstar DJ, but also house's longevity, the way that house music has survived far longer than anyone would have expected, and it's still around today. I loved it. I really enjoyed this interview, and he's talking to Bill and Frank. You know Bill and Frank, don't you, Sheryl? Yeah. And they know their stuff when it comes to this, so the questions are good. And it's great stuff. It's really, really worth listening to. But what I love is, as I said, he starts off. It's like his journey from being a classic soul boy to being sort of house head and DJ. And that's 15-year journey, and it's really interesting.
And you could almost do a book of people's conversion experiences, because it is a bit like that, Road to Damascus thing. You just talked about it. Terry talks about it, And I found that every interview I did for the book, I'd say, so what was your first time? And everyone could describe exactly what they were wearing when they got to the club and what they were wearing when they left, which was very rarely the same thing. A friend of mine was a buyer at Brown's, so very, very fashion. Her first time at Shoom, she went, I think, in a Jean-Paul Gaultier suit and left in her boyfriend's boxer shorts and a T-shirt,
I love that chapter. I love your nervousness about people undressing you in the club.
Oh, I just couldn't, I didn't understand it. The first time I went to Shoom, everybody wanted to take my jacket off. And it's like, leave me alone, And then 2 weeks later, there was I sort of in the crowd peeling someone else's jacket off,
Yeah, it's fantastic stuff. I mean, it's great that we got this audio interview to talk about and also you to talk to, because the whole thing sort of like ties brilliantly together. It's terrific.
I do really like that aspect of the audio interview, that what you're just saying, Mark, that it is his kind of journey. He talks about growing up and then getting into all of that. I think it's really interesting that it was very much, not that everyone had the same journey, but that everyone has a kind of, as you're saying, sort of metamorphosis from one stage to another. I think it does really bring the whole story to life as a, not just a historical thing, but kind of movement and a mood.
And I think that's... Sorry.
So no, carry on.
After you.
No, after you.
I think that's why House has
people.
So that's why it's lasted so long, I think, because everyone has those conversion experiences, you, Mark, later than us. But it's sort of, but it doesn't really matter. Your first time is still brilliant, and you want to do it again. And, that's something I remember Pete Tong saying to me, every year I'm a year older, but the audience is exactly the same age, because there's always new people for whom this is exciting and new.
Yeah, I mean, the pleasure I got going to Bill and Frank's lowlife parties, which were kind of like old-fashioned underground parties. And the age range was from like 17 to 65. It's extraordinary. You got all these generations of people who at different times in life had discovered dance music. And one room would be playing like Balearic and very disco-y sort of stuff. The other room would be playing kind of proper hardcore house music. And you could dip from one to the other and just it is an extraordinary experience. I'm really glad I got it late. Better late than never.
Better late than never.
The experience being in the room for. And the other thing is that like I never used to dance, because I always used to think I danced really badly. And one night I just looked around and realised no one dances very well.
No one
it doesn't
cares.
matter. It doesn't matter. It's the act. It's the act of being in that room, in that communion, and it really is a communion, And hearing a really, really good DJ just take you higher and higher and higher and higher. Yeah.
Well, I'm a total introvert, and I think that's why I've always been comfortable in clubs, because you can just go into the crowd and disappear.
Yeah.
It's not about you. It's about being part of something bigger than you. And I've always loved that about clubs.
Yeah.
That is the point, isn't it, really? I mean, it's whereas like rock culture is so predicated on the idea of staring up at these gods on a stage. This is the complete inversion of that, and the freedom of that, and the sort of democratic joy of it, really.
Well, that's when it started to shift for me. I remember in '97 going up to Gatecrasher with Judge Jules and sort of coming out to see him start his set. And he came on and all the lights came on and everyone turned towards the stage to watch him. And I was like, this isn't my kind of club at all, and not denigrating Gatecrasher at all, but it really did feel like you were going to watch an act, not to be... And in clubs I was used to, you were the act. The audience were the stars, not the DJ.
No, absolutely. And that's reached its kind of peak in America with the whole EDM movement and the ultra superstar DJ, where they're basically like stadium rock acts for electronic dance music, which is just depressing. I mean, I love it I love seeing a good... I mean, one of my favourite DJs is DJ Cosmo, Colleen Murphy, who was David Mancuso's representative on Earth, who was one of our guests on the podcast a few months back. And she's just sensational. But you don't sit there watching her. You just dance to the fabulous tunes she's playing, But
Exactly
yes,
that.
you can appreciate the quality of a good DJ. What's very interesting about your book, and actually Terry Farley talks about this in an interview, is how late people started mixing records in this country. The idea of actually creating a seamless mix was a recent late 80s phenomenon, wasn't it? People simply didn't do that before.
Very
They
much
played
so, yeah.
records. That was fascinating. I had no idea. I sort of assumed that had been going on all the time, but
No, there were, sort of scratchy sounds of needles being taken up, and in the Soul Weekenders, the DJs would get on the mic between tracks.
Yeah.
We'd have to listen to them talk before we could dance again.
Farley's very funny about George Power, the DJ Crackers, and he was a real on the mic man. It's great. It's very quaint, isn't it?
And he's scathing about his dress sense as well, isn't he? I mean, I think one of these I find absolutely fascinating, listening to the Farley audio and reading your book, is just the wonderful kind of sartorial snobbery and the sort of the codes that you know. I mean, I think I always found it very intimidating when I was in my 20s. I wasn't a natural clubber because I was just far too self-conscious, and I always felt like I'm getting it wrong. I'm getting something wrong.
Barney, you're looking at me and saying this. It's like, I have never dressed up, but I always felt I belonged in clubs because I didn't feel I belonged anywhere else, really. It's like I've never been stylish. I found the Boys' Own lot really intimidating till I got to know them, because I thought they would go, "Oh, you've got the wrong shoes on, you can't come in," sort of thing.
Farley's very fussy about that, and he talks about his own snobbery about the way other people are dressed and so on and so forth. No doubt about it. But in a way, that's almost, I don't want to say a class thing, but I mean, probably one of the reasons why I didn't get into clubbing back in the day is that it's a substantially working class thing, which comes out of the roots of things like mods and all of those sorts of things, where the notion of how you dress was important in a way that it wasn't. Let's say if Barney and I could characterize ourselves as like fag end of the hippie period sort of people, where But I mean, I remember when I was at school, the skinheads were just evolving out of the mods in 1968, 69. And it was very particular, they had to wear this jacket, these shoes, this sort of stuff. And that mod culture extended right through dance culture, I think. There's a particular sort of working class thing about appearance and about scenes and so on and so forth. And especially if you come from somewhere like Slough, where you've got kind of nothing else to do, I think it's important. I think that's part of it.
Probably right. I also stopped taking drugs when I was 24 years old. So when I'd go to clubs in the mid-80s, I felt sort of crippled by self-consciousness in a way that maybe I wouldn't now. Maybe it's not too late. But I just found it unbearable. I could not sort of lose the self-consciousness,
Maybe we should all go out and you should try it.
Well, let's go to one of those illegal raves. We'll drive up the M1 together. Now, look, Sheryl, thank you so much for joining us to talk about this. It's and anyone who's listening, go out and buy Sheryl's fabulous book, Adventures in Wonderland. Sheryl, we do love a segue on the Rock's Back Pages podcast. So the best that we can do this week in moving into a brief discussion of Mr. Mike Skinner is to note that his track Weak Become Heroes on original Pirate Material is, I think, one of the most beautiful sort of elegies for the rave era. I don't know if you know that track, Sheryl. Do you know it?
I do. I mean, it's interesting. Mike's becoming, with my clients, because I now coach sort of creatives, more and more, his name's coming up again as an influence. And I'm so glad that people are kind of starting to acknowledge his part in things again.
Yeah.
Yes.
I remember, Barney, when we were first starting Rock's Back Pages, and we'd been lent office next to Dave Stewart's studio in Crouch End, and that album had just come out, and we listened to it a lot. And it shouldn't have been something I'd have loved. And I absolutely adored that album because it spoke of a London that I recognise. It spoke of the sort of people that were around where I was. And there's something just delightful about him. I think he's just such an interesting guy. And there's a tenderness. It's weird to talk about music which is sort of out of grime or proto-grime, and yet there's a real tenderness to him and what he did. Really lovely.
I totally agree with you. Yeah, I mean, so you're a fan, are you, Sheryl?
I am.
Yeah. I thought Original Pirate Material, I would say it's one of my favourite records, one of my favourite albums, just period. I think it's extraordinary. And, he's done lots of good things since then. There was a bit of a lull. I thought Computer Blues was pretty good. There's a new mixtape album coming out this week, hence we're talking about him. And we've actually got a clip of the audio interview with Mike Skinner from 2002. The album Original Pirate Material has just come out and Gavin Martin is talking to him. So shall we just hear that little clip, Jasper?
Let's.
Original Pirate Material. You're listening to the streets. Lock down your aerial. How's it come to this?
It's an honesty thing. You don't think that anyone really wants to know about. What American rap is just glamorised living in America. So if you glamorise, well, not glamorise, but make exciting what your life. And that's just as good. It's American. Any American's leading just as an exciting or boring life as anyone over here.
Make yourself at home. We got diesel or some of that homegrown. Sit back in your throne, turn off your phone, because this is our zone. Videos, televisions, 64s, PlayStations, Webb Henry with precision.
Yeah, so we have that interview featured for free on the homepage this week. And it's lovely listening to him. And Has It Come to This has already, I think, been a hit at this point. And he talks to Gavin about just all kinds of interesting things. And we've also got a piece by Toby Manning from Jockey Slut, also at that time, March 2002. And then jumping forward to the second album, A Ground Don't Come for Free, April 2004, this is Ben Thompson talking to Mike Skinner for The Observer. He's just really, really interesting. He's also, of course, he wasn't born in Birmingham, but he grew up in Birmingham. You can still hear that Brummie twang in that clip there. Sheryl, do you feel any kinship just with him for that reason?
Yeah, I think one of the things about, my home city is we're really good at mixing stuff up. It feels quite natural to us. And I think, he was another example of that, as someone who was quite happy to mash genres and also be a bit more vulnerable, as you say. Didn't feel that he had to sort of emulate the kind of maleness that was on offer from American rappers. And I think, again, in Birmingham, there's that just a bit of space to experiment, I think, that you don't necessarily get in London.
Sure.
Yeah. Because on that first album, there's that song, It's Too Late, which is, it really is like a young man willing to sort of be a bit emotionally vulnerable and then dry your eyes on, I think it's on the second album, these are pretty soppy songs for a sort of, what does he call it? A rap project, I think is his name for the street. He caught my attention a little while later when he had this conversation with the philosopher John Gray, which I just thought, it was like, wow, from Original Pirate Material to a conversation with this guy about the book Straw Dogs. He's just a really, intellectually curious guy. I did think Computer Blues was really good. I think there are good things on the other albums. But, he's still there. He's still interesting. He mentions Wu-Tang in that audio interview with Gavin. And I just wanted to sort of note en passant that I just watched the Wu-Tang documentary on Sky Documentaries. I don't know if you've seen that, Sheryl. No. Have you seen it? It's really good, actually. And obviously, they were an influence to some degree on him. But I really recommend it. I think it debuted on American TV like Showtime or HBO last year. But it's finally come here. It's in 2 parts, so it's 2 hours. If you get a chance to see it, it's great.
Written it down.
What a fascinating group of characters. And some of them are really charming. Some of them are just nuts.
Remember our encounter with them in San Francisco airport?
Yes, I do. I will never forget that. It was such a thrill. This is the first time Mark and I ever went to America on Rock's Backpage's business, and we were at the airport in San Francisco. And I suddenly remembered, I was aware that the RZA was sitting across from the sort of waiting lounge. And then I realised that they were sort of all there And I think you struck up a conversation with you, God.
Yeah, well, he claimed to have met me. He said, I know you.
Yes.
I don't think so.
I think that's unlikely, Mr.
I think that's
Newgard.
highly unlikely. Yeah, I know, man. I know you.
I know you.
It was very funny.
Anyway, that was a tangent. I think it's called Of Mikes and Men.
The thing I like about The Streets and Mike Skinner is what he alludes to and talks about in that interview clip is about how realness isn't realness, it's just being genuine, and it varies from context to context. And I think a lot of people don't get that when, British rappers who hear American rap and go, well, I've got to do the English version of that. That's not the case. It's that you've got to do the thing that's relevant to your own context,
yes,
and then it'll make sense and it'll be authentic. But other than that, it cannot be. And I think that's one of the things that always shines through with his stuff is that it's just what he thinks and it's genuine.
Yeah, and he collaborates with interesting people. There's at least one track on this new mixtape album that he's done with Tame Impala, who we've talked a little bit about on the podcast, and that's already that's been on Spotify for 2 or 3 weeks. But the album, which has a long name that I can't remember now, is out this week. So that's The Streets.
Now let's get to the nitty gritty. Tune reminds me of my first D. Like unique, still 16 and feeling horny. Point to the sky, feel free. See a people all equal, smiles in front and behind me. Swim in the deep blue sea, cornfields sway lazily. All smiles, all easy. Where you from, what's you on and what's your story?
This is when we talk, Mark, about new pieces in the library. And we always say, Sheryl, please just stick around and jump in if the mood takes you, if you feel like you want to say something about any of the acts that Mark and Jasper are going to mention. Just pitch in.
Well, first piece is Hugh Nolan for Disco Music Echo, 24th of June, 1967. And he goes down to UFO, the hippest hippie club in London. It's basically a brief report. And he says, what other clubs give constant light shows, far-out movies, ranging from avant-garde American to vintage Bela Lugosi horror? Avant-garde jazz groups, the latest sounds in pop, stray chicks freaking out having their dresses cut off, and often the original Susie cream cheese as well. I talk about having your clothes taken
Sheryl,
off.
it was all going on long before they were trying to take your jacket off.
It's fantastic. I mean, because Mick Farron, the late Mick Farron is one of our writers, was the doorman at UFO back then. Moving forward to 1969, Los Angeles Times, George Harrison interviewed by Richie York. And so it's really interesting. First of all, he's asked about why the Beatles have stopped playing live. And he says, we performed the whole time. And probably, in my opinion anyway, we reached our peak in Hamburg. So he reckons they were at their best as a live band when they were playing in Hamburg before they were even making records. And he says, when we came back to England after the last Hamburg gig, we were regarded as a sort of new thing. But all we really were was the past brought back. It's funny when you think about it. And now then he says, just bring up to the current day. He says, in a way, Revolution No. 9 was all right, even if it wasn't particularly a Beatles sort of thing. Say that again. And sometimes I feel like a spy just pretending to be a Beatle when there's a much greater job to be done in the world. It's a very good interview. I mean, George Harrison was an articulate and quite interesting man.
My favourite Beatle. I always just
Your
say
favourite
that.
Beatle.
Always been my favourite Beatle. Cheryl, do you have a favourite Beatle?
My cousins made me choose between the Beatles and the Stones very early on. I was about 6.
That's a bit early to be making that choice.
Well, they had no one else to fight with, so it was like I had to choose, and I chose the Stones actually. And
yeah, well, me too. I think Mark and I would probably say the
well,
same.
I chose the Beatles until I think it was February or May 1968, and the Stones came on top of the pops as a promo video with face paint on doing Jumpin' Jack Flash, and then I just moved to the other side. It was that single thing.
I choose the Beatles. Sorry, chaps.
That's all right.
Well, I once interviewed Yoko Ono, and she does this thing when you go into a house where she leaves you in the room with the white piano, and she came back and I was in the hall looking at her paintings, and she was like, but the piano. And I was like, I really have come to interview you. And she just looked at me and went, really? She couldn't believe that I wasn't really sort of there to look at the piano and touch sort of places where... But I've always been far more interested in her work than his, actually.
Yes.
But then, I'm that generation where the Beatles really didn't mean that much. T-Rex was my first great love in music after the Basic Rollers, of course.
Of course. Yeah, because
you and Caroline.
Well, we can't go.
Yeah.
We'll have to have you have you on another time talking about the Rollers.
Okay, 1973. This is Lillian Roxon for the New York Sunday News interviewing on the phone Al Green. And Al Green kind of totally seduces her on the phone. You know, she just falls in love with him. And he's great. Darling, there are no tricks to life, no special formula. I'm not something you pick up and wind tight. You know, I'm hooked on entertainment. I look in the mirror as I talk to you, and I see the face of a hooked man. It's a really good interview. I mean, we just got the late Lillian Roxon on board, thanks to her niece. I'm finding her writing a revelation. She's just such a good writer. David Toop interviews Buck Owens for The Times in '89. He's talking about how much he hated the way country music had gone. I was so sick of what music had turned into. I tried to compromise, and to be quite blunt, it made me gag. I love that.
Toop, of course, was you would have known, I imagine, through The Face, Cheryl, but you wouldn't have had
I knew him before then. Steve
then.
Beresford was my flatmate, so David was around all the time. When I was at university, I lived in a flat with Steve Beresford, so I'd known David since I was like 19.
Well, of course, you did the Signed, Sealed, Delivered with Sue Stewart.
Exactly
who was
that.
Part of the whole Collusion gang. Did you write for Collusion?
Yeah.
You did, didn't you? That's right.
My Basic Rollers piece was originally, when I've retried every 5 years since, was originally in Collusion.
We had David as a guest on the podcast, and he was just a fabulous guest. I mean, I've met him a couple of times because I'm part of the sort of Southeast London improvised music scene, and one bumps into, and he's such a good man. We're real fans of David.
He introduced me to so much music.
I bet. Well, the other thing is that he's so broad-minded. I mean, when we asked him what do you like listening to, he said, I like listening to 70s soul. Next piece, and it's actually a reader's letter. The reader concerned be Neil Kulkarni under a pseudonym to berate the Melody Maker, and this got him his gig writing for Melody Maker. This letter was so good that Kathy Unsworth basically said, we've got to hire this man.
Great. Yeah.
Neil's talking about how they treat black music really poorly on the Melody Maker in the early 90s. He says, on the one hand, only whites are allowed any opacity of language, the beauty of words themselves. Blacks can only use words in a way that renders them transparent to their simple or polemical meaning. So the great pop poets are Buckley, Parsons, Drake, Chilton, not Green, Hayes, Mayfield, Robinson, Whitfield. You can talk about the poetry of your Mark Kozeleks or Kristen Hirsch's, but not your Ice-T's or Gurus. Blacks aren't allowed to have the same hang-ups, the same depth of alienation, loneliness and feelings as white. It's a fantastic letter. Basically, Neil got a gig on the Melody Maker as a consequence. Last piece is on, again, another recent addition to our writing team, the great Chris Heath. Did a huge piece on the Spice Girls to Rolling Stone in 1997. And it's just great. I love Chris's writing. He's very funny. He can write these big reports. Let me see. Jerry says, I think anybody who has a negative or positive view on us, that's fine. That's freedom of speech. That's what creates democracy. And Victoria, conversely, Posh Spice, says, my mum always said to me, when you're older, men will take advantage of you. And they just don't. Anyway. It's a really great, it's big, sort of like 8,000 worder. It's really worth reading.
Yo, I'll tell you what I want, what I really, really want. So tell me what you want, what you really, really want. I'll tell you what I want, what I really, really want. So tell me what you want, what you really, really want. I wanna really, really, really wanna zig a zig.
So that's my lot. Jasper.
I'll just mention a couple of things since we're nearly out of time. First of which, mostly because it's just very funny, the aforementioned Ian Penman absolutely tearing to shreds a couple of tribute albums that were released in 2000 he was asked to review for The Wire. A tribute album to Tim Buckley and a tribute to the songs of Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys.
Brilliant, because Buckley just got a name check in that Kulkarni letter, didn't he?
Yeah.
Great segue.
We love a good segue on the Rockstock Pages podcast. But it's just a very funny piece because is there any point in anyone trying to recast a lassitudinous space sail of Tim Buckley? As a singer, Buckley belongs to the Eternals, so aren't these little indie people just setting both themselves and us, not that anyone buys these tribute things, up for inevitable disappointment? A couple of them, he says, are all right. The rest is utterly negligible, a hinterland of unmysterious muso-indie phantoms. The compilation shows only how musically well-read and poetically blue vamp Buckley was and how rational and empty most of today's comparable musicians are. Their tunings, line readings, productions here all as flat and flavourless as the cheap beer they likely exist on.
But what's worth pointing out, we're also posting this week a live review of Tim Buckley in San Francisco in 1968 by Philip Elwood for the San Francisco Examiner. So you've got Buckley at either end.
I have a feeling that Buckley tribute album was essentially the brainchild of either Herb Cohen, Tim's notorious manager, or Herb Cohen's son. They did the same with Tom Waits. So they basically, because they own the publishing in a lot of Buckley's songs, they got all these artists to cover and hope just to make some quick money out of Buckley fans. And that, it's pretty suspect.
Dear, oh dear. Well, if the Buckley tribute at least has a long EP's worth of semi-divine music, the Brian Wilson is totally bereft of point or value. So the Brian Wilson one's even worse. So next up, I just wanted to mention for you, Mark, I had a fun interview with James Blood Ulmer from 2003. John Swenson talks to him for Offbeat magazine. John Swenson asked him if he's still in touch with Ornette Coleman and whether James Blood Ulmer is following what Ornette's doing. Ulmer goes, "You mean the music? He's playing harmonics. That's what he's doing." "But every show is different," says John Swenson. "No, every show is harmonic. Ornette Coleman shows is harmonics. He don't play no different shit. Coleman plays Coleman. He's like Miles Davis. Miles Davis don't care who the fuck played with him. He played Miles Davis. I'm the same way. I don't give a shit." The last thing I want to mention is an interview with Public Service Broadcasting, who are sort of soundscape group recent. It's a funny interview. J. Wilgoose Esquire, which is obviously a pseudonym, and he's the founding member of Public Service Broadcasting, says, "I thought it was one of the worst, most pretentious ideas I'd ever had," which he must have had a lot of, given that he called himself J. Wilgoose Esquire. But actually, I rather like Public Service Broadcasting. I saw the prom that they did last year, and it was great. They had a sort of replica Sputnik spacecraft that came up on stage because they were doing their Race for Space album, and it was a really fabulous live show. So, and I think I'll leave it there because we are out of time.
We are out of time. Can I just squeeze in at the very end here a funny live review of Britney Spears playing at during the Pride Festival in Brighton 2 years ago, and Stephen Dalton is unconvinced by her by her sort of X-rated act. He says, after pole dancing through I'm a Slave for You, Spears pulled a beaming male reveller from the crowd for some light BDSM cosplay during Freak Show. The world's least convincing dominatrix. She's more M&S than S&M. Sorry, I had to get that.
No, that's good. That's
Sorry,
great.
Brittany. So I think that brings us to the end of the podcast. It's been such a treat speaking with you, Sheryl. Thank you so much for joining
really good fun.
us.
Thank you.
Good. It's been brilliant.
A final plug for Adventures in Wonderland, which is out this week as an ebook.
Ebook and print.
So you can get it for your Kindle or you can buy it. It has a fantastic new cover, which you just sent through yesterday, Sheryl. So please go and buy that. And Sheryl, we'll have you back on to talk about the Bay-City Rollers, maybe with Caroline Sullivan and the ghost of Tam Payton. We added this audio interview with Tam Payton not long ago.
Brilliant.
Which, if you haven't heard on Rock's Back Pages, Sheryl, you must hear. It's very bizarre, isn't it?
It's very
strange old thing.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that's us done today. We will be back in 2 weeks with none other than Lloyd Grossman, not to talk about spaghetti sauces, but about his early days as, believe it or not, a rock critic in Boston in the late 60s. Boston in late 60s.
I had no idea.
Join us. I know. Yeah, there you go. So anyway, thanks for joining us, and thank you again, Sheryl.
Yeah, we're going to go out with Danny Rampling's acid house dance as described by Terry Farley. It's a great one. See you next
Thanks for
see you in a
listening,
fortnight.
guys.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
The whole acid house dance is Danny Rampin. That's his dance. That is his dance. Waving his record while he's playing the record. Up until then, DJs just used to put a record on. So like that. DJs wouldn't. A rare briefing wouldn't acknowledge the crowd. Wouldn't smile at the crowd. The crowd wouldn't smile at the DJ. There was no connection. The DJ. He's playing really good records, isn't he? Yeah. You might bump into the toilet. Oh, I really like that. What was that record? Yeah, right. And that was it.
Yeah.
Suddenly, Danny's standing up and he's waving his record like that, shouting, and people shouting at him, and people hugging him, laying over him. And it was just like, fucking hell, And that was his dance, And then suddenly it became the Shoom dance, and then the Shoom people would go to another place and people go, oh, it's all the Shoom dance, it's the Shoom dance. And suddenly the Shoom dance became the Spectrum dance, and suddenly like the whole of the fucking country, And it's his. I'm sure he stole it from Ibiza. I'm sure, that's how they, some sort of gay bloke from Spain or something was dancing in Ibiza on the podium. I'm sure that's where it was stolen from.
Yeah.
But, there was a specific, that's for me, that whole movement came pre-packaged completely. You had the dance, which was so different.
That was Terry Farley in conversation with Bill Brewster and Frank Broughton in 2005, concluding this week's Rock's Back Pages podcast. Many thanks to special guest Sheryl Garratt. Find Adventures in Wonderland on Amazon and visit her website at SherylGarratt.com. The hosts were Barney Hoskins and Mark Pringle, and it was co-hosted and produced by Jasper Murison Bowie. The Rock's Back Pages podcast is part of the Pantheon Podcast Network. You can find thousands of articles, as well as hundreds of full-length audio interviews at rocksbackpages.com.
How much time have I got, Jasper?
30 seconds.
We're 10 seconds. Starting 10.